Good morning, everybody, and welcome to another Sunday morning of the Life class. And it is the Sunday before Christmas, 12/22. And we are continuing our series on taking a deeper look at the 60 characteristics that we encounter in life if we have come from an environment that sort of qualifies as what we're calling complex trauma. This doesn't have to be any kind of a big, awful, major event, but just those things that we have learned through the years that chronically over time constitute a situation we did not get some of our 12 basic needs met. We may have had very healthy parents, but there may have been school or caretaker situations that just led us to these feelings of not being good enough, that have influenced our thoughts and our feelings and really our physical brain structures. And I'm getting a lot of feedback that people of all ages are receiving insights, light bulb moments, and really good questions that they've never asked themselves before from this material. So keep them coming. I encourage you all to continue to email me, text me, those of you out there who are receiving this online from the Podiocast. So today we come to a fact, and this is a scientific fact through research, that people that do have a complex trauma background have a lot more. As a matter of fact, Tim Fletcher, president of this institute, says tons more, as I quote from him, tons more insecurities than people who grew up in a healthy background. And I was thinking just days before Christmas here, I imagined the scene of the birth of Christ, however it may have happened. There are many versions. But thinking about all of the imperfect human beings from all of the different journeys and backgrounds and the fears and insecurities and trepidations that they had approaching that location. I do a retreat every year where I go in depth into the life of Mary as she carried this baby through mountain ranges on a donkey and then gives physical birth in a cave with a little bag of nothing but a piece of slate and a string and a rag, herself as instructed by her mother. You know, and I could go on and on and on, but you talk about insecurities that none of us can even dream of, what these people had to overcome, you know, by simply following the call of God in their life. And yet we have our own sets of awful insecurities that they could not even dream of, don't we? In our digital world, in our terrorist world. So let me define insecurity for you. This is not the only definition, but it's a pretty good one. Insecurity is a feeling of inadequacy or not being good enough to handle something. I'm not good enough to handle something. It's a feeling of inadequacy and uncertainty that produces anxiety within us about one's goals, about relationships, about the ability to handle situations. And so as we look at insecurity, I think it's helpful to realize that we have two types of insecurity. There is external insecurity and there is internal insecurity. So for a child, in order to develop a secure sense about life within themselves, needs to grow up in an environment that is externally secure. Basically, they need to know where their next food is coming from, that they're feeling safe. So their external environment, exterior, is secure. They also need an internal environment to be secure. And the problem is that with complex trauma, it creates an insecure internal external environment. There's chaos out here. You may have all the money and abundance and all this going on, but let's say it's chaotic emotionally out here. So then it creates an internal environment that's full of insecurity as well. So if you just personalize this for a minute and you look at your external environment today, it could be lots of different things. There could be people around you that struggle with these things. It could be, do I have enough money in the bank? Well, I still have a job, but they're laying off. Am I going to get canned? Is there going to be a war? Is there going to be a civil war in the United States? Is there going to be a war, in World War III? There's lots of talk, lots of theory about that right now. Lots and lots of insecurities in our external world. So we've all had plenty of that. All you have to do is turn on the news, turn on your phone. But today, let's focus on the internal securities that maybe we may have. And those could be defined as something that we don't feel good about ourselves. Now, I found myself in preparing for this flashing back so much to school, so much to growing up, so much to memories, things that I used to just like completely and totally obsess about, that because I've been on this healing journey a long time, I have left behind. And they've been replaced by new things, of course, as they always are, but I've tried this method on those two, and I find that I have tools today, thanks to all this, to deal with those things. So when someone comes to me today and says, I've never told anybody this, but I've got this mole on my cheek that is just, absolutely driving me crazy. I think about it all the time, and I never noticed the mole, let's say. Well, goodness, there's things that they can do to fix that. And here we are 2 weeks later with a doctor's referral, and they're like, but maybe the parent teased them about it. Maybe the kids teased them about it. And in their mind, they were stuck with that mole for the rest of their life. It became their identity. Things like that happen all the time. So something we don't feel good about, some characteristic about their body, as in that young man's case, maybe some characteristic about our personality we don't feel good about. Maybe we're afraid that others will think less of us, that they'll reject us because of it. Maybe we won't be accepted into a certain group. Now, that's not just about school in days past. That can be, some sort of a dinner group. That can be some sort of, people that I know are downsizing or moving into retirement homes. Had somebody the other day, totally sell their big house and move into assisted living, and she's very concerned that, what if people don't invite me to sit, at the table at dinner, and all the old insecurities are coming up at, age 80. This is something that we're faced with, during our journey. She's very interested in this material. So if that characteristic causes you a feeling of anxiety or insecurity, let's just think about some of the causes this morning. But leading into it, we really do need to know that pretty much everybody in our society or in our culture has at least some kind of a subconscious standard of perfection, or a standard of what a person has to do. Sorry, I'm getting rid of this cold. Of what a person has to do to be respected, to be part of, to belong to a peer group. And so that standard, when we start to look at it, even though it's subconscious, what kind of things does that standard, at least in America, could be comprised of? What kind of body do I have to have? What about my weight? How attractive do I have to be? How intelligent, smart do I have to be? What kind of personality is most popular with X group? What kind of clothes do I have to wear? What kind of talent or ability? What kind of job, is looked upon as acceptable. And this differs according from, society pocket to society pocket. So sometimes people are not even aware that they hold themselves to a standard unconsciously, and they're driven by it during their entire life. They just know that they don't feel good enough or don't fit in, but they don't realize that they have this unceasing, relentless push within them. They never take the time to go there and feel it and take it apart and see that it's based on childhood messages, or it's based on just core beliefs that don't even make any sense. That these are things that they wouldn't even want to do. These are things that they don't even find attractive. And if we can get on the other side of it and see the ridiculousness and the humor in it, and see that perfect isn't even something that even exists, and so who said? It can be very, very freeing. So we tell ourselves, I'm just not good enough in this area. I'm just not good enough in that arena. And I just feel like everybody else in the world is operating by this same standard, kind of like when I started out with you all. I'm going to try not to go to this inner child place where I feel like you all had the policy manual down before I came into the world, and I was just born without. I was born without a chip, to use technology standards. And then, in our worst moments, and some people live here a good bit of the time, sadly, we might feel that everybody's going to judge us or reject us if we don't measure up to that standard in life. So that's the first thing. The second thing is that we can look at the people in our world who seem to meet the standard. Sometimes, and again, I was going back to a lot of memories of elementary, high school, college, that sort of thing, looking at the people who are the most popular. And what I usually find is that they seem to meet the standard better than others. So they might be prettier, they might be more outgoing, they're funny. They're just this effortless, warm type of person who just seem to do life. And so the child might think, see, that shows the standard is the basis for acceptance. That is the standard that is the basis for having value. In other words, I don't have value unless I look like that, meet that, act that. And you can see it all over the place today in today's youth. Because you can almost see the cloning effect, with different things. So you compare yourself not just to the standard, but then also the popular people in your world. And if you don't measure up to them, it can create anxiety. And if you have insecurity in areas where you don't measure up to the popular people, well, it creates a lot of disturbance. I had a particular girl that I went through my elementary school grades with that I began to do this with, and I started really early in kindergarten at the age of 5, so I was always like 18 months behind. And I picked her out, and these are just like yesterday memories. And I picked her out because she met the standards of perfection. Her coloring was always between the lines and was perfect. She got all of her math problems right. She came in already having to learn to read. I got invited over to her house and everything was perfect. Her showers were clean. There was nothing from the grout in there, I'll never forget. Here's my mom's shower. And ours was horrible, we had 3 girls. She had a big brother who was really good looking. I had no big brother. Then she opened the door to her room. She must have 50 stuffed animals. They were arranged in sequence of size around the room. And they all had names. Ours were everywhere. We didn't even know what we had. And then she opened up her jewelry box. It was a little ballerina. The mirror was shiny instead of being grubby with peanut butter fingerprints like at our house. And there was actually jewelry in there. So she took it out strand by strand. I felt sick. I think my legs were just going like this. That put a standard in my mind. And then we started playing sports. Well, she would play basketball with her brother since she was 3 years old. You know, I didn't have a prayer. And I continued to use this yardstick. Well, what I began to see was that by the time we were juniors in high school, she ran away with this guy that was a dropout. Then we called them gracers. And her family was absolutely devastated. It flipped. The perfection standard completely flipped. And I remember that day coming home from school going, wow, maybe I've hooked my star to the wrong wagon. Maybe she's not so perfect after all. And that was a real turning point for me in my life. Now, maybe you had someone like this, maybe you didn't. But it proves my point. It's not always what you see, it's what you get. The value of external experiences. And not to mention people that disappoint us in relationships. Remember the first time you ever heard "Don't judge a book by its cover"? It's a warning. You really have to build trust slowly over time. So everybody deals with insecurity from time to time. It can appear in all areas of life. It can come from a variety of causes, and it might stem from a traumatic event. So it also might come from patterns of previous experiences. It might come from social conditioning. It might come from that unspoken standard. It might come from learning rules by observing others. It might come from local environments like school or work or home. So it's important to understand up front that every person, whether they grew up in a healthy home or unhealthy, will experience some insecurities at some time in their life. That's just part of life. But as I quoted Tim Fletcher earlier, it's important to know that people from complex trauma experience, to use his words, tons more insecurity. And here's what happens when a child from a healthy home feels an insecurity. Their parents, or whoever they lived with, will help them process through that insecurity somehow, or get them to someone to help them process through that insecurity so that it does not become a debilitating issue in their life. But children from complex trauma have a lot more to begin with, and then they don't get the help to process through those insecurities. So they respond in ways that, of course, end up making things worse. And then those insecurities become debilitating and basically become like little mental prisons within them. So many of you can relate to that. I absolutely relate to that. And I think my parents absolutely did their best, but I held so much inside because I didn't want to be a burden to a family that was already in so much pain. So, often that's another factor that the child will not disclose or doesn't want to burden the family. Let me give you an example. Let's say that you've been asked to tell your story, your faith journey, recovery story, whatever, or you're going to start a new job. And and you've never done either of these things before. You've never been part of that kind of disclosure. You've worked for one company all your life, and you feel a certain amount of nervousness. You certainly feel an amount of self-consciousness, of worry, of insecurity. So this couldn't be any more normal. So the night before, you might have trouble sleeping because your brain is wondering about this new thing and it's a bit anxious. Again, very normal. So what would a healthy child do with that? They would get tools, everybody's nervous. And they would just kind of sit with it, and they would not run from it. They would consult their parents. They wouldn't do anything crazy, but they would somehow know that with help, they could push through this process. And then they would be validated and encouraged, and the child would go and do that project. That would be that speech, that would be that book report, that would be that confrontation with a friend, whatever it would be they would handle. And they would come back and their parents might, or their friends might say, "You did a really good job with that." Or they might say, "You have a lot of ability in this area." And then over time, they might be told, "Thinking back on that, here's a little something that additionally, that could help you even more next time." In other words, a kind form of not even constructive criticism offered in the right way, which is additional knowledge for the child to build with, not criticism on the spot, like, "I can't believe you didn't do that," or "Look how you failed." And so it's done in a way that a child would be open to that. So they might be insecure for a little bit, but they'd sit in it, they'd push through it, they'd grow through the experience, and they would become stronger. Okay, that is a very healthy progression, and something as we're always all learning, something that we can all model. Now, you bring in complex trauma, an unhealthy response to telling our story for the first time, starting a new job. And oh my goodness, I think of a great example about this with my first sales job. You'd obsess for days, you wouldn't be able to sleep, anxiety might go through the roof, trigger stress response in a way that would put us back in the early trauma response. Remember the fight, the flight, the fawn, and the freeze? We might just be in survival mode. So here's a couple of responses. Maybe try to back out. What are all the ways I can escape this? Might try to come up with excuses why I can't do it. Might eventually go through with it, but then afterwards just super beat yourself up, or as you're preparing to do it in the middle of all this pain, expect yourself to be so perfect, like this has got to be the most unique, the most creative, the most perfect preparation that any student of professor blah blah blah, has ever seen. Some sort of just huge, ratcheted up, unrealistic expectation. So here's another thing that can happen. If you find one mistake that you didn't do perfectly, just this plunge getting down on yourself, and it is a deep, dark, heavy hole. So what could have been just a normal learning, hey, I learned something new, here's what I did right, here's what I can improve on next time, that's like a foreign world. This is just one more negative experience that proves I'm not good enough. You see the difference? So for many people, after that, and I talk to a lot of people who will come back and say this, "See, they made me do it, I'm never going to do that again." Or in relationships, it's often, "I'm out of here." Sometimes someone will be afraid to bring something up in a relationship, and I try to teach them how to do it in just kind of a calm way. And if they don't get an open embrace with kisses, like, I forgive you, I love you, I love you, they go, oh, I'm not here. So, they're relying on their unrealistic expectation. So for the complex trauma child, this situation has actually resulted in greater fear, greater shame, greater anxiety, greater insecurity. It's become a more negative thing in their life. So this does not come from just one thing in your home or school. It can be from many different things. So let me suggest that fundamentally the first one can be what's called attachment. And I know attachment is a theory, but it's a pretty darn good one, and one that's been scientifically proven over time, particularly with Dr. Gabor Mate, whose books I brought in, that most of this work is based upon scientifically. Let me give you a context. What is the opposite of insecurity? Well, of course, it's security. It's feeling safe, being able to relax, being okay with the way things are. So a little child comes into the world, they don't have the tools to handle the problems of the world. So they would not naturally feel safe. They would not naturally feel secure on their own. You'll notice how a baby startles. Why do we soothe? Why do we pick up the infant? They have to have one or two big people in their life that they can connect to, that they can attach to. People who are going to be their rock, so to speak. And then they will feel secure. Well, that secure person needs to have certain characteristics. Not a perfect person, that doesn't exist. But here we go back to our basic needs. That secure person needs to be a safe person. And they need to be able to meet the child's needs. And they need to want to attach to that child, which means accepting them and loving them with as close to an unconditional consistency of being as they can within their own limits. I know that isn't ideal, but there is a quality about that. And that child needs to feel loved and accepted. If a child feels that, there is an increasingly good chance of attaching to that person, that consistent rock. And they have a good chance of feeling secure. If they cannot attach, then they feel all alone facing this big, bad world. So here's where these tons of feelings of insecurity come from. Now, other dynamics happen when a child tries to attach to that parent who they want to be their rock, but they can't. So here's what happens, and this explains so much to people. Here's what the child feels. Well, it must be my fault. Surely there must be something wrong with me as to why my mom or my dad doesn't want to connect with me. I feel so much fear. And so in their little brain, it's trying to solve one primary question, and it is, what is wrong with me that makes my parent not want to connect with me? So it's like this little internal video camera that records everything, so the child replays all their experiences with their parent. I have met other people that have had similar to me, and then others who don't recall at all, but I'll just tell you my experience. Mine is as fresh as though it had been recorded yesterday, of these kinds of experiences and also my responses, because the child will go, and this is right out of the textbook, it must be because I cry too much, it must be because I get angry, it must be that I am boring, or it must be that I'm ugly. And, those are the big four the child usually will feel. So what happens is that if untreated or not replaced, then the self sort of launches into this one-way internal dialogue or script within the self. Not always, but sometimes. But that's sort of the genesis, of that if you really trace it back. So now they might look at that characteristic as being why their parent doesn't want to connect with them. And they hate that about themselves. So the child might be saying to themselves, or even carry on into adulthood, I'm too emotional, I'm too dramatic, I'm too sensitive, I'm too shy. So what the child then does is they say, that's why people won't connect with me at school. That's why this friend won't like me. So it's sort of like it just cuts off any possibility that it could have anything to do with anybody else and their stuff. It's always going to be my fault. So these characteristics are weaknesses that somehow sort of get into the air around us, and people pick up on them. They prevent people from wanting to connect because they can kind of feel the pullback. It's an imperceptible kind of thing. And so the developing child says, okay, what kind of stuff do I need to have in order to have other people want to connect with me? Well, we go back to the question, as I did, well, let's look at these other kids at school who are the most popular. Who does everybody want to connect with? And I go back to my little friend I shared with you about. Pretty one, the smart one, the athletic one, the one with the stuffed animals all in the order, the one with the clean house. Parents slept in the same room. Looked to be a normal family. That's what I need to try to have and become. But let's just say that there is nothing the child can do about it. Powerlessness again. I can't become pretty. I can't change my body type. I can't become good at sports. And then on top of that, if someone starts to comment on that, particularly the parents or critical parents, it produces tremendous shame. Especially if somebody comments on our shyness. Why can't you be more outgoing? No. If you just lose a few pounds, if you didn't eat all that, if you just stop, just lots of stuff like this. So that lack of connection has ramifications in a child's life that starts them to hate part of themselves. The second thing that happens in complex trauma is that a lot of families communicate by ways of cut downs or sarcasm, which in the Greek is wounding flesh. They think it's funny, or this is passed down through generations, and that's one of their ways of humor in the families. They tease others, they make fun of them. They might talk about a child that has large ears. They might talk about, I mentioned being chubby, all kinds of different things. They might even give them a hurtful nickname. And then this could continue on in school. There's bullying by siblings, or they might find a characteristic about another child and talk it up, tease about it at home, broadcast it to others, or you just maybe never knew where the next shot was coming from. These things are not funny. So, what happens is the child may develop a tough exterior and shoot back, but, the damage really is done through the years. So it's safe to say that the more pain we felt as a child when we were teased about something, the greater the feeling of insecurity about that area would be as an adult. but you may never have a person admit that because those defenses are so tough. I'm over that, whatever, but it can pop out sometimes. Another thing that happens in complex trauma families is that we may get punished for certain characteristics. Getting punished for being too outspoken, because we cried too much and for too long, because we clammed up and we wouldn't do that trick or tell that joke, or hid in the back at the class play because we were so shy, and maybe they had to force us to get out front, but then going home we got punished for it. All kinds of different things. So we see that as something bad about ourselves, not just something part of our temperament that may or may not totally change as we develop as a person. In other words, labeling, bad, 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 bad. So again, we have criticism in the family. You're not good enough in this area, you can't do this right, you can't do that right. And so if we have modeling of maybe their own parents, grandparents, great-grandparents, where there was successive criticism with little to no validation that was modeled or taught, that produces a lot of insecurity. And then we've also talked in this class about a feeling of disengagement or non-attachment if you just feel like you don't belong to your family, just that feeling of, where did I come from? Surely not from here. I don't feel like I fit in. You know, I'm the black sheep. Definitely that's an insecurity. Children who have been abandoned and then later adopted, rife with insecurity because the child is always pretty certain there's a whole lot about them that must be bad for parents to give them away. And also too, getting our sense of value from the wrong things. I am, constantly just amazed at the story of people in their 60s, 70s, and even 80s whose mothers were obsessed with their weight and their looks, and may have gone through like the diet pill phase of the 60s and 70s where doctors were just throwing it, and their lives have been ruined because maybe their mom was always preoccupied with their body, or being, and had this kind of dysmorphia thing that's really, really hard to treat, or let's say even both parents were having the stylish clothes, the haircut, the latest new cars, keeping up with the Joneses was the value system, of the family, and the child was never taught to have internal, enduring, resilient resources, and they have to learn a whole new design for life, maybe at middle age. So there's 12 different things, and I'll see how many of these I can do today. We may continue this Sunday after Christmas. There's 12 different things that characterize complex trauma families that contribute to insecurity. And as always, you can kind of do a little self-check off if you so desire. You may come up with a couple of things that might be helpful for you. These are the two areas of internal insecurity. The two areas are my physical characteristics and my personality characteristics. And neither one of these are things we can change about ourselves particularly. And so these are the things that as children, or growing up, maybe we feel powerless about ourselves, and maybe this is where, in learning the art of grace and acceptance and self-love, and most particularly those 35 scripture verses I gave you 2 or 3 weeks ago, learning that we are created perfectly in God, and that we are already accepted, and that what is really important is that God's love is flowing through us to others, and what our mission on this planet, our short stay on this planet really is. So, over the years, a lot of years, and also Tim Fletcher and I kind of put our notes together on this. These are just a dozen different things. So, mostly the appearance thing weighs in very, very heavily on people that come from complex trauma families, the number one that we find would be the weight. So there's this looming magical number. You know, it's not one number, but it's like in the person's head. There's some sort of an image or shape or number that everybody needs to attain so that they will be okay. And so there's generally a lot of pressure put on the child regarding their weight, and creates an insecurity. So what you'll find, not always, but you'll find if you gain a pound or two, that just ups the insecurity the person feels. I came upon, it's really sad, I came upon a woman in one of the several locker rooms at different places that I go, who was absolutely emaciated in her 70s the other day, and she weighed and then she took off her coat. She weighed and she took off her shoes. She weighed and she took off her skirt, and you could tell that she was like, what else can I take off, you know? And I had already written this part, and I was just like, oh my gosh, you know, she's one of that generation who probably lived through this. Again, freckles or moles, I told you at the very beginning about a case like that. Acne, not so much now because they have so many cures, but acne used to be a horrific thing. Treatment. Teeth used to be a horrific thing. Now with dental care and so forth, but for people who cannot afford that or have access to that, too crooked, teeth, spaces, all of this used to cause a lot of teasing and social problems. Noses. Can you remember before plastic surgery how people used to get nicknames and all of this, and people could just be cruel, and on and on and on. Hair too straight, too curly, all of this. Men, the bald thing, the hair transplant. I mean, our whole culture is just completely obsessed by every single feature. And lips. The billions of dollars that go into collagen, whatever it is, I mean, who would have thought 30, 40 years ago that so much attention would be driven to that? Girls as young as 12 and 13 begging for an injection. People don't like the color of their eyes. They don't like that they have to wear glasses. So I don't even need to go on to all of these body parts. So people have a magical standard of what perfect really is, and if they fall short, there's this cultural thing. I'm falling short. I have an insecurity. So this is just a real cultural disaster. Another thing about personality, I'm so glad that really early on that I started, I trained in Switzerland at the Jungian Institute, and Carl Jung, who started that, the father of psychology, was so clear about introversion and extroversion and what a continuum that it is, and how it's all so valuable and acceptable. And when people started writing books about the value of the introvert, because Americans were just sort of all over this fact that being an extrovert was the way to go. You needed to be powerful, have a voice, be social, be the life of the party, be in command. And actually, being an introvert, they make the best salespeople, the best listeners, all of this. So there was a real inequality about the perception of the shy child. And I think a lot of this has balanced out, but a lot of damage was done in saying that an extrovert, was of more value than an introverted child. So that's one thing that I think, was sort of projected onto introverts. There's something wrong with you if you don't have enough courage to, get in there and mix and be like the rest of them. And many of us are glad we're not like the rest of them. We're trying to just be ourselves, and be uniquely us. So, try to skip a little bit to this. I think insecurity about, not just fitting into the mold. Some of us didn't like that we were a tomboy. If we were girls, some of the boys, were very artistic and were into fashion designing, these strict, stereotypical kinds of things that were just brutally rigidified, in past years, did a lot of damage to social cueing, making friends easily. These things do not come easily. And there are a lot of people that pretend that they do, and they don't. They just absolutely do not. I remember the first time my boys, when they were really little, they looked up at me and they said, Mommy, how do you look like you have confidence? And I just laughed and I said, well, it is something that you practice, but you don't feel like it on the inside. And then that led to a great kind of first discussion about, remember when we first started talking about feelings, but that your feelings are not the facts and all that. And I just thought about that this morning, actually, that there are some things that you have to do, but you're still going to feel these things, inside. And my second son and I have talked about that moment a whole lot as he's done a lot of speaking all over the world. And that, both exist. And the feelings are so normal, but there are ways of talking to yourself that allow you to not freeze, and it's but some people, are either if they would talk about it, I think they could kind of get out of that frozen state. If they would know how normal it is, and that the best speakers or whatever it is in the world. Look at Barbara Streisand. Horrible fear of singing in public, worst in the world. You ever hear that? These are people who had to conquer massive obstacles. So what I'm going to leave you with today, and we'll pick back up next time, this unrealistic standard of perfection when you go into Christmas, when you go celebrate with your family or whatever you're doing, whether it's with yourself, small, medium, or large, try to realize what this cluster of neurons in your brain is saying when it comes up with this verbiage of, if they don't like my gift, I shall be very disappointed. Oh my goodness, they didn't have the cheese grits this year, and they know it's my favorite. Maybe they don't love me after all. Try to realize the spouting of the ridiculousness and realize that this is not reality. This is about your brain trying to wag you like the dog. God has given you your being, your soul, your substance, and the brain is simply one more tool that you are learning to master. And try breathing in unconditional love and acceptance. It's not about you. It's not about what your brain is saying. It's about what you can offer. And what you can offer is the light of the Christ child within you, coming out of the darkness, not just this Christmas, but each and every day. What does the light do? What does it do? It banishes the darkness. And that's what these tools do. All that darkness you've been dwelling in, all that negativity. If you practice these things, it will start to get lighter and lighter and lighter. God bless you this Christmas.